Shalom and welcome to another edition of Parsha Talk. We should really call this Pesach Talk, Parsha Pesach, the Pesach edition. I'm Rabbi Elliot Malman in Highland Park, New Jersey, and joining me my good friends, Rabbi Barry Chesler out there in Long Island. Barry, and Rabbi Jeremy Kalmanovsky in New York City, Anshe Chesed. Great to see you both. We're enjoying Pesach here. We're getting ready for the second set of days. Day 7, day 8, diaspora here. We're not going to comment on that.
You know what?
Day 7. We're going to focus on some of the highlights of what takes place in Shul on day 7.
Ellie, can I say one thing? You know, it's Parsha Talk, Pesach edition. It's a commonplace in Hasidic literature that the name of the holiday is Pesach, the speaking mouth. So Parsha Talk is about the Pesach.
Pesach. Right. Very cool. Well, speaking of Hasidic traditions, we didn't talk about this as we were preparing for this, but there is a Hasidic tradition I have heard of during the 7th day of Pesach in reading or reciting Shirat Hayam, the Song of the Sea, that the Rebbe actually walks through the congregation and the people split. They split.
They split in the sense that they walk out.
I have seen, this is absolutely one of the unforgettable and crazy things that I have seen in Jewish tradition. So the Jerusalem Hasidim, sometimes called Reb Arla's Hasidim, they were of Reb Arla Rat. These are the extremists. The other extremists think they're and if you've seen the Hasidim, like sometimes they wear a sort of a tan coat with a little blue pinstripe. That's Reb Arla's Hasidim or the old Yerushalayim Hasidim. And Reb Arla Rat, I think he died relatively recently. I think he died into the 1930s or something like that. He's all about faith against the absurd. Like it's all about just throw yourself against all impossibility and faith, and so at late night on the Shvi Shel Pesach, they have this primal scream thing. And when I went, the year that I went, the Rebbe was very, very old, so he didn't. They explained to me that usually they do that splitting thing that you just said. He was not capable, but what they did was a call and response, and it lasted like probably a half an hour at least, verse by verse. Somebody screams a pasuk from Shirat Hayam, and the whole kahal screams back. And it was like, I mean, I'm sure there were like, I don't know how to estimate, but they were probably 30,000 people in the room, or not something you'd want to do in the age of COVID. But
so what did it do for you?
It was what did it do for me? That's a good question. It was very moving to see people to simply lose all restraint and give themselves up in a kind of ecstasy of faith and ecstasy of religion was really quite unforgettable.
A further question though. So that's you as the observer.
Yeah.
What about as a participant? Did it move you in any way?
It's not been a long time, so I'm having some difficulty remembering, but I definitely never lost the feeling of being an outsider, because how could you possibly lose the feeling of being an outsider in that group? But to just lose your restraint and say Mi chamocha ve'elim Adonai that was just like, let it out, just scream Mi chamocha Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed ad ya'avor amcha Adonai ad ya'avor am zukanita. Wow, it was also a feeling of cathartic, ecstatic release, if admittedly as an observer.
Okay, so there's another Hasidic tradition, I believe, that is sometimes used as an illustration of Kavanah, and this is about Shirat Hayam, but actually is part of the morning tefillah where Shirat Hayam appears, is that there would be people who would roll up their pants before they would recite Aja Shir so that they wouldn't get wet.
It's so fascinating that we have these rituals connected to Shirat Hayam, and when we normally talk about the parsha, we get into the verses, we get into the drama and the characters and the text itself, but here obviously the reading of the parsha on this day represents something beyond just the parsha. Barry, I want you to talk about this because I think it's really important for us to understand that at some point religion has to be based on a miracle.
So I think that the Shirat Hayam is an essential part of Pesach. And we forget about this sometimes because we live in Galut and we have an 8th day. But the crossing of the Sea of Reeds and looking back in wonder and seeing the dead Egyptians and exploding into this jubilant song is actually the completion of the Exodus. That everything has led up to that moment when they cross over and they sing. And I often remarked that this is the paradigmatic miracle in the Torah, the crossing of the sea reeds, and yet it has two explanations in the Torah itself. One is that Moshe raises his staff and the waters miraculously split, and the other is that God causes an east wind to blow all night and it holds the waters back, which we can understand as a natural explanation. But I think that, it occurred to me today that there has to be some sense of transcendence, that we cannot explain everything rationally and think that we're going to solve all of our problems ourselves as human beings without reaching out for what in religion we call the divine, that is the core of religion and therefore also the core of Judaism.
Jeremy, you have a take on this in terms of, so this, I mean, with the ritual and the sense of transcendence that you may have experienced in either a reenactment of it or a recitation of it, we are trying to reach for something here, and we're trying to reach for the miraculous aspect of this experience.
I do certainly agree that that religion, to be religious, needs elements of transcendence. I don't think that it's adequate, at least not for me, to say that all of the wisdom in the world is human wisdom or accessible to human wisdom. That all of the power in the world is human power, accessible to human power. To be a religious person, I do think you need to recognize that there is some force and power, some wisdom that you can have only when you encounter a non-human reality. So I definitely believe that there has to be a non-human reality. Shirat Hayam and Exodus, chapter 14 and 15, don't, for me, really work on the level of more than the poetic. Like the poetic, it's just so incredibly powerful that they have this birth imagery, that they cross the uncrossable obstacle. They escape from the foe that they cannot escape from, and at the other side they cross over and they look back and they see Mitzrayim met al Sfat Hayam, and they see that Egypt is at last behind them. But as an event, it's so like supernatural that I find that it works just as a powerful story, but not something that I can look back to and say, this is a thing that happened to the Jewish people. Whereas Revelation and Exodus from Egypt, I think those things, they have to exist in the lives that human beings build and discover, right? That human beings discover a wisdom that is beyond their own, that teaches them, that human beings discover the possibility of the victimized escaping their torture, and that feels like it's the divine teaching them, the divine leading them, and that's the part that really works for me on a much more like on a much more factual, so to speak, or tangible level.
I want to just seize on this idea of the boundary. The miracle part of it is something that, of course, we enter into our imaginative moment. We read the Torah and we are stepping into a different world. It's part imaginative. It's certainly a spiritual. It's a religious world. We're stepping into these characters and the lives of these characters, and in the leap of belief here, we are standing at the banks of the Sea of Reeds, and we are walking through, and we are coming to the other side. And I think what the story demands of us, and here I'll play the storyteller, the story demands of us to imagine ourselves as if we are, in fact, standing there, and gives us the paradigm of boundary. That the Sea of Reeds represents for us an element of the story that is so critical, and frankly, critical to many of the other biblical stories in which the characters cross over boundaries. And now that we have crossed over this boundary as a people, we're on the other side, and life begins on the other side. Barry.
I want to add one other thing. So I like very much what Jeremy said about the poetry but it's worth thinking about some of the actual psukim as we discuss this, because your point, Elliot, is that we get to the other side and that's a clear boundary. But the poetry seems to preserve the sense of actually going through the Sea of Reeds itself. It's, in other words, we're on a journey and there are discrete moments. And I was thinking about this while you were both talking, that we have these contrary images of God. We have Adonai Ish Melchama, God is the man of war. And then we have Mi Kamocha Adonai Nedar Bakodesh, who is like God clothed in holiness. And it's hard to square those two images, this militant God and a holy God, because I don't think we're talking here about a holy war. There are other parts of the Bible that talk about that, but that there is a jumble of emotions as people are crossing through, and people are trying to process what's happening to them. And then, let's face it, for us, we understand that this is a poem that's written after the event. It's not someone on their iPad jotting down notes that they're going to weave into a poem as soon as they get to the other side to preserve that moment by moment thing. I mean, this is real artistry, and it is an attempt, I think, to make us think actually that we are walking through with our ancestors, which I think is of utmost importance.
I often point out, that there's a visual pun going on in the text of the Torah itself, because you have the words Uvenei Israel halchu b'toch hayam bayabasha, and you have the words bayam, and on two sides of the line, and Bnei Israel inside it. It's a really cool kind of thing. But so I want to go back to this, because I think that this is right before the recitation of the song. So it says, "Vayashuvu amayim veyachasu et harechav et haparashim." The water covers everything. Lo nishar bahem ad echad. Not a single one of them is left. Uvnei Yisrael halchu bayavasha b'toch hayam. The children of Israel walk on the dry land in the sea. V'amayim lahem choma miminam umismolam. The water was a wall on their right and the left. And then it says the next verse that we say every day, Vayosha Adonai bayom hu et Yisrael. God saved Israel from the Egyptians. Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim. Israel saw Egypt mit al sfat hayam. So they saw Egypt dead on the banks of the sea. That's gotta stop you there. I mean, and then the very next verse, Vayar Yisrael et Yad Ulah, Israel saw God's outstretched arm. Vayirum et Adonai, they fear God. Vayaminu b'Adonai Moshe Avdo, and they believe in God and Moses, his servant. Can you take me philosophically, theologically, spiritually from that moment? Can you imagine yourself now at the bank seeing the terror of it, and then the exaltation?
it's interesting to speculate what really is the miracle here.
Yeah.
Is it the crossing or the fact that the waters recede and cover the Egyptians? So when the Israelites are marching through, however they're getting through, on one hand, they know that they're rushing to safety. On the other hand, they know that if they could do it, so could the Egyptians.
Yeah.
It's not until the waters cover the Egyptians that they understand that it was a path only for them.
So let me just interrupt and say the word is Vayar Yisrael et Mitzrayim. That Israel sees Mitzrayim. They don't see Mitzrim. They see Egypt. And maybe is that I mean, obviously they are Egyptians, but they're seeing that there's a part of them that's gone now, that's dead. The part the part that enslaved them, the part that was just terrorizing their lives, that's dead. You know.
That's exactly. I think that's what it is exactly.
That
There's another possible shot, which is, it's like, man, it was like all of Egypt was out there. It was like it's such a throng that it looked like all of Egypt. But yeah, I think that the experience of the liberation is that Egypt is really finally at last dead to them. Now they got a new challenge.
The other point we have to make here is that for this generation, they're going to have no other encounter with Egypt or an Egyptian again.
Okay,
they see Egypt dead because there's no one left now and within their lifetimes.
So they are going to have adversaries in the desert. Amalek is right there, and of course, once we get into the book of Numbers, you know, Moab, Ammon, the works, they're all going to be there. But this is the first time that they are free. How do you go from that terror to elation? You know, do we do that? I mean, is it something that we've ever experienced really, or something that we can really liberation? You know, we are so fixed on, and of course we have Yom HaShoah coming up in a week also. So we tend to make associations. At the liberation of Auschwitz, people just didn't know what to do. They didn't jump for joy.
Well, they couldn't.
They couldn't.
I mean, physically, they couldn't.
But I would say that to me, the small detail is Vatikach Miriam et Hanivia et Hatupim biada Vatitena kol anashim acharei batupim ubim cholot. That Miriam the prophet took out the tambourine in her hand, and all the women came behind her with their tambourines and they're dancing. They packed tambourines. Like, unlike Auschwitz, who when they left, when they were imprisoned in concentration camps, they had nothing. They were barely surviving. At some point, the Miriam and whatever the other people with her planned for music, and to me, that's just a lovely little detail that suggests that they expected that there was going to be time for singing. Whatever. So I think that there's a little act of faith embedded in that little detail.
So that's a good way to segue to the second part of it. You know, there was a certain life affirmation. It's not an accident that it comes, with the women, and the women are so deeply associated with both the redemption and the meritorious women that were themselves responsible for the Exodus to begin with, and the notion that there is song, and there is exaltation, and that there is love, and that there is a way that the people connect to each other with love and reflect on their relationship with God through the metaphor of love. And here, of course, I'm referring to Shir HaShirim, which is, while not always on the seventh day, this year happens to be the seventh day because it is Shabbat. But we need to talk about Shir HaShirim, because Shir HaShirim is just so emblematic of the next period of the calendar that we're going into. And it reflects one aspect of the relationship of God and Israel, especially as it is reflected in the holiday of Pesach.
Before we leave
Yeah.
the Song of the Sea, I want to make one other point.
Go
I,
ahead.
I suggested once many years ago that Miriam was the first cantor because she led the community in song. But the other aspect here that I think is worthy of note is that she dances and plays music, both forms of art that are not expressed in words, because the spontaneous reaction to this salvation, you can't articulate. You can express yourself, but it's very difficult to put it into words.
Yeah, but
And the words only come later.
okay, so they're singing the words. They're singing Shira Go Susvarachvo Ramavayam.
Right, but I was commenting, Jeremy mentioned the instruments, which were
Right.
the critical piece here.
Indeed, indeed. Okay, so speaking of instruments and speaking of song and speaking of instrumentality and metaphor and the place of the Song of Songs here on Pesach. Why? What's it doing here? Why are we do associate these different books of the 5 scrolls with different holidays. Why Pesach? Why Shir Shirim? Take it.
Well, Kohelet doesn't really work for Passover. It's not. But
That's the book of Pesach.
Doesn't really work for anything.
Echa. How about Echa?
Eicha should have been.
Lamentations.
No, it's oh man, I just think it's wonderful. It's perfect. Uh, um, it's Hageshem Halaf Halachlo Koator Nishma Be'atseinu Veita Zamir Higia. The rains have gone away, and the voice of the turtle dove. It's the time of love, and it's true in the world. And spring comes, and that's this after a cold, or we hope will be a cold, wet, rainy winter in Eretz Yisrael. It's the flowers are blossoming, and with that comes young love and human eros, and so Shir Shirim works on the natural level, because let's go see, have the figs given forth their blossoms? Are the grapevines in blossom yet? And that's part of the natural waking up in spring after winter, and the relationship of the two lovers in the song, interestingly, by the way, never consummated. The lovers in Shir Shirim are always seeking, never finding, or running away and just barely missing. It comes to symbolize in Jewish tradition the passionate love of God and Israel. I would say, with my little bit more mystical orientation, the worshipers of Israel and their passionate love and delighted love of God, as well as the metaphorical or allegorical, Jewish people, Knesset Yisrael, and the divine, or in a real Kabbalistic sense, the divine female and the divine male. But those feelings of ecstasy and arousal and joy and delight and all of that stuff is not foreign to worship. It's not, we're not all, super celibate people. We're actually called upon through Shir Hashirim to bring some of those otherwise, loving and delighted feelings into worship.
So the relationship between God and Israel is symbolized through this loving relationship. It's really a marital relationship, not even a marital relationship. It's also the relationship of lovers. So I would like to ask whether or not that is audacious, to even imagine that, and B, whether it's accessible. I mean, so let me ask it this way: How audacious was it for people like Rabbi Akiva, who said upon Shir Shirim that if all the Torah and all the Tanakh is the holy, this is the holy of holies. This book represents something holy, and how remarkable is that kind of statement, allegorizing God and the Jewish people as the two lovers? And
So we don't really know enough about the rabbis' internal lives, I think, to answer that question definitively. we don't ever really get a sense, I don't think, of the erotic nature of Rabbi Akiva's life. So when he says that Shir Shirim is like the Holy of Holies, is he referring to the erotic part of Shir Shirim or the allegorical part of Shir Shirim?
He
And
was certainly animated by love. He I mean,
well, so what I wanted to suggest is that Pesach is the act of passing over and delivering the people is an act of love. The problem for us, I think, is that the way most of us think about Pesach, Pesach was a one-time event that happened long ago. We're invited, as we discussed last week, to think about ourselves ke'ilu, as if we had left Egypt. But love is perennial and annual. It can be part of our daily life. And no matter how far we may be from love at any moment in our life, we can grasp it in the next moment.
yeah,
That's
what about that explosion? What about that, that engulf in flame love, that passion, that moment of, ignition? That's also there. I mean, that's what this book is about, Shir Hashirim. Yeah, Al Mishkavi Balelot Bikashti. You were quoting that. I'm at night I was seeking Bikashti Velomasi. I'm looking for him. I can't find him. This unrequited desire or this unfulfilled desire, longing.
By the way, the only word, the only, Shir Hashirim gives a little bit of a run for Esther being the book that doesn't mention the divine, except at the end, Rishafeha Rishpe Eish Shel Hevet Ya. So the what Elliot was saying about the flaming up, love is kasha kishino kina, kasha kishao kina, as hard as death, aza kamavet, strong, as strong as hell and as strong as death. Its fires are shalhevet yah, the flame of the divine.
Oh,
It's
right.
pretty intense.
Pretty intense. Mayim rabim lo yechlu lechabot. The great waters cannot quench this love, right?
Right.
Like the Israeli
so
song.
love offers hope. And I think, springtime and Pesach as a national holiday are great signs of hope for the future. But love is what drives most of us in our personal lives. That's what we want to be part of our lives every day. We don't necessarily crave miracles the way that many of us crave love in all of its manifest forms.
I think that you can't, I may never receive a revelation and I may never experience a nace in a conventional sense. But I think that all of us, if we don't have love, and that can be, romantic or erotic love, hope it is for everybody, and it can be, filial love and parental love and friendship love and the love of kindness and all these, the way people have different words for different sorts of love. You can't live without that. That's for sure. And Shir Hashirim comes along and makes that front and center in the Jewish ritual calendar. By the way, Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah tractate called Yadayim, in which the quote unquote defiling the hands, which is a rabbinic way of saying scriptures are holy enough that if you touch them, your hands acquire a level of ritual impurity. They argue about whether or not books mitameat hayadayim, and that's how they say that they are or are not canonized. And Rabbi Akiva is the one, as you guys were talking about, just clue in all our listeners here. Rabbi Akiva is when somebody says, yes, we took a vote and affirmed that Shir Hashirim is of holy status, he says, Chas v'shalom, God forbid, because there's never been a day in Israel like the day Asher Nitan Bo Shir Hashirim li Yisrael, the day in which Shir Hashirim was given to Israel as if it were revealed, which is an amazing comment, right? An amazing comment that this is as if that King David wrote the Tehillim and Solomon wrote Kohelet. To Rabbi Akiva, God wrote Shir Hashirim.
So
Fascinating.
this allows the rabbis to dispose of the problematic metaphor in Shirat Hayam of Adonai Ish Milchama, of God as the God of war, man of war, because now we have a God of love.
Well, yeah, God of love, and the miracle. The miracle is also the miracle of love. I guess that's what you were saying. I mean, as you were saying what you were saying, Jeremy, I was thinking, well, there are miracles. Muttle the tailor.
Yeah.
He met Huddle. That was a miracle too. Wonder of wonder, miracle of
Well,
miracle.
you're supposed to meet Seidel, though, Elliot. That's the
Title. I'm sorry. Title.
Seidel took Huddle's boyfriend. That's how.
That was a miracle too.
I love that song. I love that whole show. That show is like the American Jewish sacred text.
It's canonical.
It is canonical.
One last thing about Shir Hashirim is that, and it's connected to the Omer. I once heard that all of the imagery of nature that is in Shir Hashirim, the fruits, the flowers, etc., are things that are actually quite active during this time, between Pesach and Shavuot, and that of course is another aspect. We're not going to go into really deeply here, but we are in the Omer period now, which is itself a very, very interesting, complex period of arrival or of aspiration and movement, which is I think what is being propelled here in Shir Hashirim, a sort of desire and coming close to God. Anila dodi v'dodi li, the sense that there's movement of Israel, the people, and God coming together as two lovers in this in this book, and of course during this time as well. So we're just about ready to conclude here our conversation, but looking forward to let's just talk for a second. So after Shvi and Shmini Shel Pesach, we are entering a complicated time where things for us in the organized Jewish world, they do it. Don't you get the feeling that the whole calendar shifts, the whole rhythm of Jewish life shifts, and it does mean that we are turning a corner on the year. I mean, Jeremy, that's your sense?
Totally. Well, we get the yoms. We get the
national days,
the modern holidays, and I think so. When I say I've never experienced a nace in a conventional sense, I do think that the kibbutz galuyot and the gathering of the exiles from every country on earth back to the land of Israel, especially for those people of whom there were many who literally crawled out of concentration camps and responded to the most severe destruction in Jewish history with the most incredibly hopeful act of rebuilding in Jewish history. So I do think that if there's a miracle to be reflected on now, it's the events of the middle of the 20th century.
Absolutely. Very neat.
So we have this collision between mythic history preserved in the Bible and perhaps in the early rabbinic period and actual history. So we're going to have in quick succession Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, the Israeli Memorial Day, and Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And then about a few weeks later, we have for many people another day that's made it on the calendar, Yom Yerushalayim, which marks the reunification of Jerusalem under Israeli sovereignty. And these days do not quite fit in what has become the tenor of the Omer, which is a period of semi or quasi mourning, which is, according to tradition, rooted in a plague that befell Rabbi Akiva's students. But I heard Jacob Milgram speak many years ago about a relationship between Chamishim, 50, the days of the Omer, and the Chamsin, the Shirako, the desert wind that comes and sweeps in off the Mediterranean and destroys crops in its wake. And it's been a time always fraught with danger that our ancestors struggled with how to explain in some kind of religious way. But what we have today is an imposition of the events of the last 75, let's say 80 years now. Maybe even that we could go even 90 years. And it's changed the way that we look at everything. And, we do well to remember that, at its bottom, religion has to be rooted in life as we know it, not just life as we've inherited it.
Well, we are thankful that we are rooted in your lives. So we are, we really, really appreciate the time that everyone has spent with us in our Parsha talk. And we want to wish everyone a joyous end of Pesach, beautiful last days. Let's hope for good weather. Let's hope for good times together. If you're able to be in shul, great. If you're not, do it however you do it. Celebrate, be together, enjoy. From all of us, we want to wish everyone a Chag Sameach, beautiful Pesach, end of Pesach. Enjoy, and thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you soon. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Shabbat Shalom.